Hello everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Teaching Campaign Planning, 3 Tips that Drive Action, with Dr. Regina Luttrell and Luke Capizzo. My name is Vicki Velasquez, and I'm the PR Marketing Manager at Sage Publishing. Let me begin by introducing you to our speakers. Dr. Regina Luttrell is currently an Assistant Professor of Public Relations and Social Media and Director of the Graduate Program in Public Relations at the S.I. Newhouse School of Public Communications at Syracuse University. A contributor to PR Tactics and PR News, as well as peer-reviewed journals, she is a noted speaker where she frequently presents at national and international conferences and business events on topics related to the current social media revolution, impact of artificial intelligence on news and society, the ongoing public relations evolution, and millennials Generation Z within the classroom and workplace. She is the author of several books, including Public Relations Campaigns, An Integrated Approach, and the PR Agency Handbook. Prior to entering the educational field, she spent the first portion of her career in corporate public relations and marketing. Her extensive background includes strategic development and implementation of public relations and social media, advertising, marketing, and corporate communications. Luke Capizzo is a PhD candidate and instructor in the Department of Communication at the University of Maryland, specializing in public relations. He is the co-author with Dr. Luttrell of Public Relations Campaigns, An Integrated Approach, and the PR Agency Handbook. His research interests include global public relations, civil society, financial communication, and public relations education. Before coming to the University of Maryland, he practiced public relations for 8 years with a focus on media relations in the financial services, commercial real estate, manufacturing, retail, and technology industries, serving in both agency and in-house roles. Working with a wide variety of clients, from the Fortune 500 to small businesses and nonprofits, he garnered media coverage in top national outlets and trade publications, secured and prepared clients for national cable news interviews, and led projects to improve agency-wide media training, staff onboarding, and client evaluation and reporting metrics. He has earned the APR designation through the Public Relations Society of America. This 1-hour webinar will be recorded and archived for future viewing. We will be sending out a link to view it and to access the slides to all registrants in the coming weeks. If you have any problems with audio or viewing mode during the webinar, please use the Q&A box at the right of your screen, and one of our helpful team members will get back to you as soon as possible. At the end of the webinar, we will have some time for Q&A from attendees, so please also use the Q&A box to ask any questions to speakers throughout the webinar. Please also take note of the webinar hashtag, #SageTalks, and feel free to ask questions or leave comments on Twitter. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to Dr. Luttrell.
Good morning. How is everyone today? Thank you for being here. There we go. This is what's up on deck today. So when Luke and I began pulling together this presentation, we talked about the planning process that happens before we even step foot in the classroom. We discussed which elements of campaign planning students gravitate toward most. But then we started to settle on these areas that students struggled with most. So we examined where we would spend the majority of our time in the classroom and one-on-one discussions with our students, and decided that today we really wanted to talk about the research process, setting objectives, and overall plan cohesiveness. So today we're going to begin our discussion by going over the ROSTIR model. We'll delve into the 3 what we call pain point areas for students, and then close with tips for campaign planning. Before we do, though, we do want to hear from you. So tell us, what are the most difficult aspects of teaching campaign planning? You can send us your questions via the question box on the right of your screen. And as Vicki said, we're going to answer those questions at the end. And of course, if you feel so inclined, please use Twitter, reach out to us. Our Twitter IDs were on one of the first slides, and then you can always use the hashtag SageTalks at any time. Okay, so let's talk about the ROSTIR model a little bit here. When Luke and I were writing our campaigns book, we developed a simple but really what we thought was a robust model for public relations planning that went beyond what is typically taught using either rope or race. You know, both of us before becoming professors worked in the industry. So what you see here is a model that emphasizes sound research, yet it helps students understand the strategic planning process using paid, earned, shared, and owned. And so this very first phase here, this research and diagnosis, to diagnose means that as practitioners, we have to ask ourselves, why is a PR plan necessary? So in this initial stage, we can define problems or possibilities for the organization by conducting thorough research. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in depth in a couple of minutes. In terms of objectives, we have an entire section where we'll focus on SMART objectives that support goals. But I want to add that the objectives really need to be specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. But again, more on that later. Strategies. When we talk to our students about strategies, we want them to understand why they should be leveraging organizational strengths, because strategies should reflect the unique internal and external organizational environments so that you can create the best and strongest campaign. Strategies support objectives through complementary channels, and they reflect, different audiences, implementation stages, and message components. Tactics, which I think most students sort of gravitate toward first because they're some of the easiest, I can create a website, I can create a brochure, is an important element in our planning process here. And for us, this was unique in our model in that we emphasize the importance of a tactical mix using elements from Ginny Dietrich's paid, earned, shared, and owned model. And this really focuses on converged media efforts. In the implementation phase, we talk about project management, so defining budgets, timelines, workflows, to actually implementing the plan over a specific period of time. And we also talk about the fact that implementation delves directly into the reporting and evaluation aspects, because for us, evaluation and reporting doesn't just happen at the end. While we focus on, what were the successes, how could we have done better, if during some other portion of the planning phase you need to reevaluate, that's okay. So anyway, easy to some of these reporting results that we'll talk about today, they're easy to generate, scannable, and they can be customizable.
Thanks, Gina. Let me speak a bit to the first piece of our puzzle here, research and diagnosis. And we use the word diagnosis consciously to help students understand this idea that in the early stages of doing research for a campaign, really what they're trying to do is define that problem or opportunity, right? And I like the way that diagnosis gets students thinking in that sense of, like a doctor, right? We're going in to understand what's wrong and see what we can do to fix it. So that involves looking at the situation. It also involves looking at the organization. And then we start thinking about what are those metrics that are most important for us that might turn into the measurable elements of objectives that we can set. Again, those of you who have gone through the APR process, for example, you know that the Public Relations Society of America really emphasizes measurable objectives. And so I feel like that's a really critical piece for us to stress as instructors, and something that can be challenging for students to grasp at first. And we have to understand where those fit within the broader scope of the organization's goals, and within that, the communication goals. I really like the way that Katie Payne, in many of her writings, but particularly in her book, Measure What Matters, focuses on saying, okay, what are the things that the organization wants to achieve as a whole? And then what are the pieces that communication and public relations can have the largest role in actually helping us achieve? Figuring out the answers to those questions is actually a research problem in essence, right? It's something that has to happen early on in our work with a specific organization or campaign in order to really understand where they need to go and what we can do as public relations counselors, whether that's in-house or agency, to help them get there. Again, these are really challenging issues, I think, for students to understand at the start of the process. And Gina and I appreciate the chance to utilize and teach the ROSTIR model, in part because I think it puts these issues front and center for our students. Another key piece to emphasize, while we have the R at the beginning of our model in ROSTIR, as you can see in the center of this circle, it's also important to point out, and I do this from day one, that research is not a process that only happens at the beginning of the campaign. While we focus first on diagnosis and goal setting, which I would categorize as part of the developmental research phase, which I think also includes that metric setting and baseline setting before we can finalize our objectives. I also emphasize that students need to understand the importance of refinement research, which I would define as research that is done to continually improve and optimize our campaign work, right? So on the social media side, that would include things like tracking which posts are getting the most engagement. On the media relations side, that might be understanding which of our pitches are being picked up by reporters and which ones are getting discarded, and really thoughtfully analyzing why is that happening or not happening. Those are just a couple of examples of refinement research that goes on during the tactics and implementation stages of the campaign, where we're just trying to improve and tweak every piece that we're implementing. And then finally, as you know, we do evaluation reporting at the end of the campaign. A lot of this research gets back to looking at, first off, did we achieve the objectives that we set out, which is critically important, but also looking more broadly, what did we learn from the information that and the messages that we put out into the world, what worked, what didn't, and what can we take as insights that can inform the work we do in the future. Again, that's why why we drew both of these as circles, as ongoing processes, because the work from one campaign, both in terms of the implementation as well as just the research, should feed into what we do next.
Yeah, I would have to, I just wanted to say one quick thing there, that I think what I appreciate most about the ROSTIR model is that it is circular and there is a flow to it, so that students don't always have to feel that, oh, I'm done with research, so now I move on to the next phase. That's not how it works. There has to be a continuous flow throughout the entire process, all the way till the end of the campaign where you're reflecting back.
Thanks, Gina. When we think about audience research, this is another critical part of that process, where I think it's easy for students to get stuck sort of looking at themselves, right, and difficult for them to put on the hat of another audience within the context of doing this sort of outreach. In teaching social media, we find that students gravitate toward Instagram, right, because that's where they happen to be right now. And we have to understand that not all audiences that they want to reach digitally, that is a preferred channel, right? If for those who are a little bit older, if we're talking about older groups, Instagram may not be a good fit, just as one example. So I try to help students by having them think about identifying their audiences, prioritizing their audiences, and then analyzing them. So how do we take both qualitative and quantitative data about those audiences to try to understand who they are and where they are so we can meet them there, right, rather than trying to force the people who we're communicating to go somewhere new, right? We want to find them where they are. The other challenge here, and I teach in a program where RPR students have a sort of general social science research class. It's their research requirement. which covers some of, I think, the really important tools that they need to do effective professional public relations research, but not all of them, right? So I think we can balance good social science practices with doing some more applied, focused, practical research, looking at things like demographics and doing audience surveys, message testing, to really help our students understand how to not just throw their ideas out into the world and see what sticks, but to pre-test and understand that they are not always their audiences, right? You don't know sometimes until you ask what the best messages are that will have the most impact.
So let's talk a little bit about SMART objectives here. Setting appropriate objectives in the planning process is critically important to the overall success of a campaign. It really sets the tone for what is going to be executed. So as professors, we need to help our students understand that without clear, measurable, and attainable targets, achieving success can be very difficult. When we teach about setting objectives, we want to have our students start with one simple question. What do you want to accomplish? And I know that seems really does seem base, but if you think about an entire campaign and we're looking at what's the overall objective here, where do we want to go, it is something that provides our students with a base, and then from there you can launch and build something bigger. You know, that one question, it sort of sets the tone for putting our students in the mindset of a manager. So what is the overall outcome, and why is that important to the organization? Why is that important to our client? Why is it important for this campaign? I often have my students write a few objectives on the board, or I'll toss a few objectives up on the whiteboard, and we can brainstorm effectiveness. So for example, if we were creating a campaign about breast cancer awareness, we might just start with that. Raise awareness about getting an exam. Okay, that's great, that's good, but it's really not enough. So then we start to tease out and talk through, you know, while awareness is important, what is even more important, and how can we modify this objective? And so then we'll continue to build out, and we work through until we come up with something that is a SMART objective. So maybe at the end it's raising awareness by 25% during the month of October and driving mobile mammography exams by 10%, right? So now we have this objective that answers the what as well as the who, the when, and how much. And so I often find that before my students create their own campaigns, if we run through an exercise like this, they're better prepared to create those SMART objectives for the campaign that they're going to have to execute. Because in our campaign and execution class, we work with an actual client. And so our research class sets them up, and then they come into our campaigns class, and they have to build out a full campaign that's executed over the course of a semester.
When we think about how to build these objectives, I like to provide my students with a quick formula to think it through. I think, you know, we can agree that the best objectives, the ones that we want to strive for, are the ones that are most closely related to our goals. You know, that R can also mean that relevant or, you know, goal related, I think is a good way to emphasize that. So rather than tracking the number of likes, for example, on a Facebook post, we want to track things like changing awareness, opinion, and behavior. So in this case, I like the idea of action plus context plus audience plus volume plus duration to ensure that students are capturing all of those different parts and pieces to reflect that SMART objective. So here are just a couple of template examples. Again, with a new product launch or an event, it might make sense to raise awareness. When we're talking about issues management, maybe the important piece to track is public opinion over a period of time. So as Gina described, we can talk about the degree of change that way. And when we can, it's always wonderful to be able to measure behavior. This idea of measuring things like donations made, web pages visited, products sold, right, are all great behavioral indicators that we can track. Additionally, having this hierarchy, again, of awareness, opinion, and behavior allows us to think about how we can move our audiences and publics toward completing a behavior that we want them to complete. One thing that I go back to for my students is this idea of, you're not going to buy a product if you don't like the product, and you can't like a product if you're not aware of the product. And that's just as true in a nonprofit sense. We're not going to make a donation if we don't think that the nonprofit is worthy, and we're not going to have an opinion about it if we're not aware of it. So these are really staged, in essence, and we have to think about how our publics will move through these different stages of understanding to action about our organizations. So for example, if we have a new product launch or maybe a store or a footprint in a new community, you can't necessarily start with a behavioral outcome. We have to think about starting with an awareness outcome in terms of our objectives. So these are things that I, again, try to let my students soak in, right? To help them to think about the ways in which these different pieces of setting objectives can take prominence based on the type of situation that they're in, based on, again, how are they diagnosing that problem for their organization.
Here are a few additional examples from a PRSA Silver Anvil winner, DoubleTree's Cookie Care for Hilton. So the time-bound aspects of these objectives are built into these three examples because the campaign was the duration over 1 year. And so that's also, a good example that I show to my students, saying that that time-bound piece can sometimes be a factor in the campaign itself. So let's just look at a couple of these. For example, number one, increase business and leisure travel's consideration of DoubleTree by at least 2%. So when DoubleTree was able to report out, they were able to take this objective and then say, okay, so in the first 2 months of the campaign, brand consideration among leisure travels increased by 10%, and then overall brand increased by 2%. So they've achieved this metric here, but if they weren't able to put this in a very simple, measurable, attainable, and realistic objective, then they have no way of coming back at the end to evaluate, to say, yes, we achieved it, or no, we didn't. Another one here, number 3, so generate 100,000 consumer sweepstakes entries. So again, they set this base goal of 100,000, and over a year's period of time seems pretty realistic, right? So again, they achieved 150,000 consumers who entered the Cookie Care sweepstakes, and then they surpassed that goal by 50%. To help our students frame this, I often throw out a couple of these questions. So what audience restrictions and boundaries are appropriate? Do you need to start with a baseline? So for example, you're starting this sweepstakes that happens at the beginning of the year and ends at the year. So you're starting with a baseline of 0. So, looking at what is applicable and how your students can relate that back to the overall campaign is really important. Another aspect that I have my students look at: what timelines would be reasonable to complete the objective? And then, of course, how success is going to be measured. When we're looking at reporting and evaluation, I think one of the biggest factors that stands out for me is that data drives our decisions today. So it's vital that our students understand the importance of metrics. PR practitioners have 2 important tasks when a campaign ends. Number 1, they have to catalog, evaluate, and learn from the successes, challenges, and really any sort of missed opportunities. And then the second piece is they have to report these results back to their peers or leaders. So in class, we talk about having these debriefing meetings. And so what happens during this debriefing meeting? Well, essentially, your students have to pull together and provide sort of an executive summary of key takeaways. And the very first question I always ask was, did you reach your objective or not? It's that simple, it's that blunt. And so sometimes it's yes, and sometimes it's no. And if it's yes, then we look through and we say, okay, great, so what worked? And if it's no, then we have to ask ourselves what didn't. So, consider the types of strategies, tactics, and the channels that the campaign could have used or did use and why those were successful or not. Sometimes you need to really look at the internal organizational structures or even resources. Perhaps, midway through the campaign, there's a change in personnel. And so what does that mean? Who's taking on more responsibility? Maybe you need to plan for extra help if it's a big event that's happening. But the only way that our students are going to understand these pieces is if they take a really hard, long look at the campaign from beginning to execution. And some of the other pieces that I like to have my students look at is to move beyond some of these findings. And so looking at what you can do for future campaigns. So what was learned about your target public? How should, future objectives be structured differently to maybe better reflect organizational goals or clients or goals that your clients are setting out for themselves? How can, what tactics worked particularly well and how can they inform your choice for future tactics? And then even looking at messaging, what messaging worked for the campaign, what vehicles worked best, was social media the best, or if your target audience skews a little bit older, is it time to pull out the old brochure and send a direct mail piece? So again, evaluating every aspect. But it's absolutely important and necessary that we do have evaluation. One of the models that we use is the AMEC model for measurement, and this was originally created by Richard Bagnall. And what I love about it is that it's really simple. It's an image and it's a grid. So at the top of this grid, you have exposure, engagement, influence, and either action or advocacy. And then on the left-hand side, you have paid, earned, shared, owned. And from there, students can easily see how to measure their objectives. So they can look at, okay, we had a paid strategy and we were looking for engagement. So did people click on our link? Did people go to our website? So it's a very simple way for students to see the different actions along with the strategies and tactics that were implemented.
So another challenge, zooming out a little bit and thinking not just about each of these stages within the ROSTIR model, but the entire campaign as a whole. We often think of the challenges that students have in terms of cohesiveness. And this happens at two levels that we'll talk about here. One is the idea of our goals, objectives, strategies, and tactics working together, or sometimes with our students' campaigns, not particularly working well together. And then the second piece of that, which I'll talk about in a minute, is this idea of the individual tactics within that comprehensive PESO, paid, earned, shared, and owned model working well together or not working well together. So quickly here, I always like to review not just the definitions of goals, objectives, strategies, and tactics individually, but I want to think about them together. So for my students, I always differentiate goals and objectives by saying that goals are broad, they're aspirational, they're not specific, they don't have the kinds of metrics that we talk about in objectives. And that's a tough habit for us to break. I think colloquially we talk about what we want our organizations to achieve as goals, and there are a lot of practitioners who speak that way as well. But again, following the PRSA's approach, I think it's really valuable to differentiate our objectives as the specific measurable pieces which help us to meet our goals. And again, we want to then imagine our objectives as collectively working toward what those goals are. So each objective is not in total going to solve the problem, but if we have 3 or 4 objectives that all supporting each other should work toward that goal. Next, how do we achieve those objectives? Strategies and tactics can also be difficult for our students to differentiate. I like to think of the strategies as the place where we choose our channels and approaches, again, in a little bit broader sense. So a strategy might be using media relations or using social media to convey a certain message, whereas the tactic would be, pitching these specific reporters at these specific outlets. Just again, as one example. of how I would make that differentiation. So again, critical to differentiate those, but then also think about how they need to work together. We may have, for example, one strategy that directly supports one objective and we think will do all of the work needed to complete that objective. But more likely, we will have multiple strategies to support each of our objectives, or strategies that might support and help us achieve multiple objectives. Similarly, our tactics often, again, multiple tactics could support one strategy. Again, reaching out to, for example, print, television, and radio reporters might be part of a broader media relations strategy, or utilizing Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn might be part of a broader digital strategy. But things could also be structured so that one tactic, such as holding an event, could help an awareness objective, and could also help and the strategies that would support it, as well as other objectives that talk about actually getting our audiences and publics to take certain behaviors on behalf of the organization. One way that I help students to conceptualize this is by thinking about the tree of how all of these things fit together. So like I said before, we may have a goal that really highlights what the organization wants to achieve. We might decide that there are two key objectives that help us find our way toward that goal. In this case, I've developed 3 strategies, 2 of which support one objective, 1 of which works across objectives. And then similarly, the tactics in some cases support one, in some cases support multiple strategies. Those of you who have been through the APR process, I drew the same kind of a tree when I took that exam. When I went through the portfolio side of that process to talk about the campaign that I implemented, because I wanted to demonstrate how that work, each piece of it fit together, and how I understood its connectivity. I'm going to show you a second image here that, again, I think speaks to the ways in which these approaches can look very different depending on the strategies and tactics and objectives that we select. It's really important for our students to imagine that while a tree may be the easiest and simplest way to describe this, often in real life things get more complicated. All of our strategies might support one objective, even if some of them also support another objective. Our tactics might actually support multiple strategies at the same time. So again, I want students to not always think in a purely linear fashion, in a sense that one thing can only work toward one other thing. But I want them to lay out their campaign plans in this way, because I've found real success in forcing them to think through that process of, okay, if I use, in this case, strategies A, B, and C, does that work to accomplish objective number 1? As well as, in this case, if I'm looking at objective number 2, will strategy C get me there? Similarly, this is kind of a rare situation in which you'd have 2 tactics that would both help to accomplish all 3 of these strategies, but it's possible. Again, I would ask my students, thinking through it logically, is this the right approach to accomplish the things that they would want to accomplish as part of their campaign? The second piece of this process, as I mentioned, is the idea of thinking through our tactics in a complementary fashion. So again, when we think about the PESO approach, which I hope you're all familiar with, again, this is a core part of public relations campaigns and integrated approach, and a core part of the way that I believe we should be teaching integrated outreach, in large part because it helps remind students that all of these different types of approaches to communicating with our audience we should consider, right, for every campaign. This doesn't mean we have to use everything, but at each stage, we should think about, does it make sense to utilize paid media here? Does it make sense to do earned media or media relations outreach here? Do digital channels make sense? And are there ways that owned media, such as our website, blogs, or even the physical locations for our organization, can help contribute? And also, it's important not to forget that many types of common tactics today don't clearly fit into one of these 4 boxes, right? They're in these areas of overlap, as this graphic, while it's not a beautiful Venn diagram, I think shows nicely that there are areas where, for example, influencer relationships through digital media in this day and age, in some ways can reflect earned media, because they are relationships that often influencers want to have a relationship and a connection to a particular brand. They want to believe in a particular brand or product before they endorse it. It certainly involves shared elements if they are an influencer through a channel such as YouTube, but often it also involves some sort of a monetary relationship. So again, to me, that can often fit into into all 3: paid, earned, and shared areas.
Yeah, and I just want to add, we're living in a converged environment. Marketing, PR, social media, advertising, we're all coming together and with one sort of shared goal for our clients or our organizations. And I think what I love most about this model is that it creates a foundation for collaboration. So, as Luke just talked about, practitioners can choose from a variety of approaches, whether it's controlled, uncontrolled, narrow, diverse, wide, you name it. This PESO model allows us to have freedom to create a very comprehensive and integrated campaign. It provides an all-channel, all-inclusive approach, which I think really resonates in today's marketplace.
Again, for our students, I think this is really important because it forces them to consider all of their options. It's really easy for them to say, oh yeah, let's use social media, and skip media relations. Or maybe they just got out of their PR writing course before their campaigns course, and they're only thinking about media relations. And they're not considering the ways in which maybe for a product launch, you need to spend some money and do traditional and digital advertising, right? Or how are you integrating the information that's presented on an organization's website with the things that are happening from a media relations perspective? So again, the idea of helping our students to think about which of these tactics will not only work in order to accomplish the goals and the objectives and the strategies which we've laid out, but how can they work together? When does an earned media approach fit well with an owned media approach and a shared media approach? When does a paid approach help to support what's happening on the shared or owned side, for example? So again, getting them to ask those questions as we look not only vertically in that campaign like I showed before, but horizontally across those tactics, I think is critically important.
Absolutely, and we can open it up for questions. Vicki, I don't know if you have any questions that are coming in.
I'm sure. Thank you very much, Gina and Luke, for your informative presentation. Yes, now we will spend some time addressing some of the questions from the audience. So please continue to send them into the question box on the right side of your screen or on Twitter using #SageTalks. And if we can't get to your question by the end of the hour, our speakers have agreed to address them in a follow-up blog post on the Sage blog, Sage Connection. So first of all, an audience member asked, Dr. Luttrell, are you able to share the document you referred to about measuring campaigns after they have been completed?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. I can send it to you, Vicki, and then maybe that can be part of the blog post. We can share it in there.
Yes, absolutely. So you can definitely make sure to look out for this. The follow-up email we'll be sending out with the link to the blog post, and we will have that document available. So let's see some other questions. So Not all campaigns classes give students the opportunity to implement, and students often miss the opportunity to see that real-world campaigns are never enacted completely as they were planned. How can we teach flexibility and adjusting during the process?
Well, that's a great question. I think, again, we struggle given the confines of a semester that, in some cases we're able to work with a client, class client, and do some degree of implementation, but we're not always able to do that, again, within the volume that we have to teach. So I know a lot of campaigns classes end with a plan. And for me, I always like to emphasize, on the one hand, talking about that refinement research that goes on during a campaign and thinking about the ways in which that can impact and point toward adjustments in the campaign as it's going on. So that's one approach. I also like to think about and describe campaign outreach to our students as experiments, right? So each step that we take is an opportunity to test something new and see if it works. And if we're being smart social scientists, we should easily see that some strategy that we thought would be a home run to accomplish the things we wanted to accomplish for our audiences and publics might just fall flat. And so it's important for us to do that. I also think that bringing in speakers who are practicing professionals, I know some instructors are really able to share their own valuable experiences in this way, but it always means a lot to hear that from someone who's in the field, speaking to their own challenges and struggles. I think means a lot, and in a broad sense, it comes down to being willing to speak about failure, right? Willing to talk about scenarios in which things don't always work out.
Yeah, I just want to add one piece here too. In my class yesterday, it was kind of funny. I gave my students a case study to pull apart, like where's the background statement, where's the core problem, what's the research that was conducted all the way through to the objectives and evaluation piece of it. And one of my students said they didn't even consider XYZ as part of their, as an objective or, a measurement. And I said, right, and this is, an award-winning case study, and I said, so sometimes not all campaigns are perfect, and right here, clearly, we've outlined an area where they really could have measured that could have given them so much more than what they were looking at. And in this particular campaign, only focused on social media efforts, but what they were trying to do was increase applications to their internship program. And so that was a missed opportunity. So it gave me a good example, though, to say to my students, here's this large Fortune 500 company, and here's what they measured, but here's how they could have even looked at this campaign in a much richer way. So I'm not afraid to use examples that aren't perfect in class, because I think that also helps our students.
We could also think about ways to develop in-class exercises that would actually simulate that kind of reevaluation and flexibility. So I could imagine positioning students within the context of a campaign, right? Giving them the skeleton of a campaign plan that exists and saying to them, well, you just did, these 3 things. Here's what happened in your initial round of outreach. Here's what worked. Here's what didn't. How would you rewrite parts of this plan? That's something I could do in a 20 to 30 minutes, within one setting in class in small groups. And I think that might help them to understand how that might play out in real life. Again, we should be learning from everything that we're doing as part of that refinement research. So I think there might be some fun ways to integrate that into really interactive classroom activities as well.
Okay, great. One other question. Some student writing is of poor quality, off message, doesn't fit audience needs, etc. How do we help students identify and execute good strategic writing?
One of the things that we do in our campaigns class, and I even do this in our social media class, I have students, because again, our research is separate from the campaigns class, but I have them go through an exercise once we receive our client to do some additional research and build a target audience so that they can understand, you know, we're trying to reach females ages 35 to, you know, I don't know, 50. These are their likes, these are their habits, this is their income, so that then we can start to paint a picture of who is the target audience that I am writing for. And I find that sometimes that helps my students really frame, okay, the messages to this person need to be maybe a little bit longer. They're not short snippets. It's not necessarily Snapchat, but I can reach them on Pinterest, or I can reach them on Twitter, something along those lines. So it gives them that base to say, this is the person I'm writing toward. In terms of strengthening writing skills, I think all of us as PR practitioner educators, that's something that we have to continually work with on a regular basis. You know, in my writing class, we have weekly writing prompts that happen. I try to focus on clear and succinct writing, and I have all of my students, I have them write an exercise, and I start off at 100 words, and then I make them cut it in half, and then I make them cut it down to 25, because often they're used to writing maybe a term paper, and in a term paper we can go on and on, but in PR we might only have a couple of sentences. So to try to be very strategic in what I want to say, and if I push them to the point where they have to use 25 words to say something that they originally had 100, I think it helps them to focus a little bit more. Luke, do you have any other tips?
Yeah, no, it's a tough challenge because we have you know, in our writing classes, again, the program where I teach at Maryland has a very you know, sort of classic journalistic mindset, right? We're trying to teach them those core values of news writing and journalistic writing, so they understand the backbone of media relations outreach. But we end up giving them 1,000 different things to think about. And so it's challenging, I think, for them to then turn around as they move out of those classes into the upper level coursework to understand, okay, is this piece of writing working or not? So I often boil it down to audience, and I have them think about, okay, who, you know, number one, who is receiving this, and then how are they receiving this? So if that person is a journalist and they're receiving a pitch, is this the best way for that journalist to read and understand the pitch? Is the language, you know, written in a way that they would understand? Is it so concise that they don't have to think very hard, right? They can see at a glance whether it's something that's going to be useful or valuable for them.
I just want to add one last thing. These are my two favorite questions. So what, who cares? Because at the end of the day, whoever you're writing that message for, whether it's the journalist, so what? Why should they care about this pitch that you're writing for them? Think about their audience, going back to what Luke says. So those are always my two favorite questions.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next question. In my experience, students often struggle when understanding how much goods, services, and professional time might cost in the context of a campaign. How might we expose them to real-world budgeting scenarios and actual costs as part of the planning process?
Oh, I love that question. I have my students create a budget. Whether they are going to execute this campaign or it's fictitious, they need to create a budget. And we often talk about fixed costs, soft costs, an overarching budget of $20,000 so that they can start to frame out and understand that everything that we do costs money, even the salary of a person. How much does, you know, a PR specialist make versus a, you know, an account manager or a public relations manager, right? So those all matter. And so by creating that budget and them seeing that in real time, and even going so far as to say, okay, so you said you wanted to have lanyards as a giveaway at this walk that we're you know, developing here. So go on to 4imprint, see how much a lanyard costs and break it down by, is it 150 lanyards do you need? Do you need 500 lanyards? So that at the end they can see that truly tangible, okay, I had a budget of $20,000 and I wanted to get lanyards, but you know what, they were kind of expensive, so I had to end up getting pens. Whatever that decision making is, because then that also helps them make those decisions in the middle of it, whether it's real or fictitious. And then the other thing that I like my students to do is keep track of their hours. So on average, interns are billed out at an agency around, it varies obviously from agency to agency, but anywhere from $25 to $50 an hour. And so I tell my students, when you are working on this project, I want you to imagine you are using billable hours that you would at an agency, so that then they can also see the value of their time that they're putting into this project.
I think one example of a tactic that's really difficult for students to wrap their head around cost is something like a video. Because if I say, and I remember this from my agency days, right? A client says, oh, it would be great to have a short video to do this. How much would that cost? And the answer is, from $0 to $1 million. You can have an infinite budget almost for those types of productions. And so when students come up with those types of ideas, which is great, it gives us the opportunity to talk about, okay, why would you choose different approaches to creating a video? Is this something that makes sense to do as an informal, rustic, if you may, piece that a student could shoot with their phone, edit themselves really easily, and put something together that would be effective but not cost too much, no frills, right? Maybe that's the right fit for your organization and your audience and a really simple message. But even if you're a nonprofit, if you want to have a video as part of a major fundraising event that people are paying, several $100 a plate for dinner, for example, you're going to want to have a higher quality video. So what does that mean? Again, these are costs that are different in every market, so it's hard to give specific numbers. But I try to utilize, again, professional speakers who are out there in the field and try to pin them down on a couple of those things if I can. If I always ask them about budgets if it comes up organically to try to ensure that students are hearing from them, oh yeah, we spent $5,000 on a video, or we spent $20,000 on this video. Here in the DC market, that's an easy thing for a lot of organizations to do based on their size and the expectations of their audiences. So again, it's a case-by-case basis, but forcing students to think through those numbers in great detail and to understand, well, why would I go with a $200 video versus a $5,000 video versus a $20,000 video? In what circumstances would that make sense? I think is a great start for them to understand what they'll need to do in the next stages in their own careers.
Okay, great, thank you. And another question. In addition to the challenge of making campaigns strategically cohesive, students often struggle to generate campaigns with clear, singular messages to resonate with audiences. How can we help and remind students to simplify and clarify their campaign messaging?
Well, let me start. Let me take this one first, Gina. I think one of the biggest challenges, and this gets back to the ideas that we talked about for students in terms of making our goals, objectives, strategies, and tactics align with each other, and then making our tactics align with each other. Another layer of that challenge really comes back to this idea of, are the messages the same across tactics, across channels, in terms of what students are putting out there?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, oh, I'm sorry.
No, please go ahead.
I just want to add that, in my class, oftentimes when we come across something that isn't quite clear, we do brainstorming sessions. And so like I said, I throw stuff up on the whiteboard and then we talk it through. And so if there isn't clarity there, that's an opportunity for me as a professor to say, okay, we're not really heading in the right direction here, and let's look at this and figure out why. And then do a step-by-step process where my students, all of them in the class, can jump in and we break it down so that we end up with this one clear message that then they can take forward with their campaigns.
I think that's great. It's often a challenge in part because we talk so much about segmentation, right? We talk about ensuring that that we have the right message for the right audience. But the best campaigns have a sort of singularity to them in terms of a main takeaway. They have a core, they have a center. And so I think it's important when students are writing a plan to always question where is that center and sort of force them back to answering that question and how that core central message will play out through all the strategies and tactics. And the other thing I like to remind them of is the fact that, we as PR people spend a lot of our time thinking about a certain organization, right? We think that organization is sort of the center of the universe, and we can think about a lot of big, complicated ideas relevant to them. But when we're thinking about our audiences, I ask them, how much time do you spend thinking about which cereal you buy, right? How much time do you spend considering, which gas station you choose to use to put gas in your car, right? Probably not very much. And so the types of messages that they need to consider for the vast majority of their of their campaigns are messages that are really, really straightforward, simple, and and highly memorable for those audiences. So again, to me, that's a nice check and reminder for them to help point them back toward the sort of messaging approaches that are going to be most impactful, most effective.
And I just want to add one last bit here in terms of a class exercise. I often will have my students, when we're talking about creating this one clear message across channels, I will have them look up their favorite brand and look up one of their latest campaigns that are running. And so then I have them track it through each of the paid, earned, shared, and owned, and specifically looking at the different, in my social media class in particular, the social channels that they're using. So on Pinterest, what message are they sending? What image are they using? And is that different than the tweet that they sent out about it? And then I try to help them find that connective tissue, whatever that happens to be for that campaign, and clearly illustrate that on each of these channels, this message is consistent across. However, on this channel, we're focusing here. If the press release has much more information, and these are the, they're targeting the journalists, so they include statistics and links and images and maybe B-roll footage. But again, there's that one flow that is throughout the entire campaign. And that helps my students also see, oh, I get it. It's the same message. It's a similar message, and it's clear and it's consistent, but we are targeting these different audiences in different ways.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Well, that is about all the time we have for today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and a special thank you to our speakers. In the coming weeks, please be on the lookout for an email that includes a link to view the entire webinar and slides, as well as answers to some of the questions we didn't have time for today. Please stay connected with us on our blog, Sage Connection, for information about upcoming webinars. Thank you.